Good morning, everybody from Toronto. In fact, I'll say a very sunny Toronto and a special greetings to Jiří Přibáň, who's in Cardiff in Wales, and maybe he'll tell us what's going on in Wales later in his chat this morning. As some of you probably know, I'm Robert Austin from the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. I'm in my office today. I like to do these talks and discussions from my office, and as I said, I got a nice sunny day behind me after a very foggy morning. Just let me say a couple of things before I hand it over to a good friend, Barbara Falk, to introduce Jiří and carry on with the discussion. You know, Czech and Slovak studies at the University of Toronto has a really long history. And in fact, lots of times in partnership with Barbara, we do a series of events. And this is our second annual Making and Remaking Central Europe series. It started in 2018 when we had, and that's when I met Jiří, when we had the 100th anniversary conference that Barbara and I put together. And Barbara, that was one fantastic event. I've got to tell you, it still says, you know, we really did good work then. And we decided to keep it going. So in 2019, 2020, we hosted 5 scholars, some from Central Europe, some from the United States, like Mark Kramer, for example, and even one Canadian scholar, Pierre Guimond, who had been ambassador in Czechoslovakia in the final days of Czechoslovak communism. So we decided this year we do it again. And once again, I turn to Barbara Falk, because Barbara Falk is like emblematic of the best friend and best colleague. She's so collaborative, and she never, you know, she doesn't use the word no. So if I say, hey, Barbara, let's do this, she never says no. She always says yes. And we decided that we would do this series again this year. We got 4 talks, everybody. Today is our first one. Jiří launches this series. And on November 6th, you'll see Barbara Falk again in conversation with Petr Burianek, who's the new Consul General of the Czech Republic here in Toronto, and also a practicing historian who used to work with Václav Havel. So take a look at that on our website, everybody. It's coming soon, again, 2 weeks today, November 6th. That's the second series. And again, Barbara's going to do the kind of main work today. I'm going to observe, of course, but let me just say just a couple of things. We always thank donors, because this Czech Studies series, and actually Central Europe series, is benefits from, you know, 2 people who are important, actually 3 people to be precise. I want to thank Georgina Steinsky and the Jan and Georgina Steinsky Memorial Czech Studies Fund. And I also want to thank Milo and Ivo Siptak and the Siptak Fund for Czech Studies here at the University of Toronto. Usually, if you were here, right, Millie and Ivo, and I hope they're out there in Zoom land, Millie and Ivo would take you to Niagara Falls.
Yes, yes.
Like, you know this, right? You go to Niagara Falls. And by the way, today's a great day to go to Niagara Falls. It's going to be 27 degrees here in Toronto, and it's really sunny. So just think that after your lecture, normally Ivo would drive you to Niagara. You'd have a lunch at the Skylon Tower and look at the falls and take a trip on what used to be called the Maid of the Mist, but I think it's called something else right now. But having said that, special thanks to those 2 donors. I want to say just one thing about Jiří, okay? He came in 2018 and we had such a nice time, and we became what we call fast friends. It was such a terrific conference, but then I was reading this IWM post, right, Barbara? You know, this journal that's put out by the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, which I have a close connection to, and Jiří does as well. And I read this article by Jiří about the pandemic. I was like, Jiří's a genius. I got to get this guy to Toronto. I circulated that article to so many people, Jiří, and one of my students, former students, a great journalist in town, David Katai, he read the piece and he goes, that guy Jiří, he really nailed it. I read parts of it out loud to my wife. It was so perfectly conceived and written at the length that is also perfect for me. Right? So I thank you, Jiří, because the article, and alongside the one that Krastev wrote in the same issue, really got me thinking, and it's an example of academics like you making this kind of information accessible and understandable to ordinary people. So I thank you for that. And again, I'm going to hand it over to Barbara Falk. I'm not going to read Barbara's bio. It's already on the web. Okay. But let me reiterate, Barbara, I'm so grateful that we partner on these things, that we've been friends since, I've forgotten, but since I came here. Let's leave it at that, which was about 20 years ago. And Barbara, of course, is at Canadian Forces College, Royal Military College. She teaches here in Toronto. She's like me. She's very devoted to students, and she's played a huge role at CERES, and we're always grateful for her. So I'm going to say that's it for me, everybody. Jiří, I'll see you at Niagara Falls next year. Okay? Barbara Falk, over to you, and thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Rob. And thanks also for your collegiality and your commitment to Czech and Slovak studies at the University of Toronto, which, as you know, goes back to my mentor, H. Gordon Skilling, who founded the center back in the 1960s. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Jiří Přibáň, As many of you may know, he's a professor of law and director of the Center of Law and Society at Cardiff University. He graduated from Charles University in the auspicious year of 1989, where he was then appointed professor. And in 2006, he left Prague to assume his current position at Cardiff. He has been at too many institutions to count, but in all places where he has absolutely made a difference: EUI in Florence, NYU, UC Berkeley, University of Pretoria, the Flemish Academy in Brussels, New South Wales in Australia. And if you've read Jiří's work, which I have, and I would highly recommend his last two books. I'm going to do a plug here visually. The Defense of Constitutionalism and more recently in the Quest of History, both of which are in Karolinum's prestigious Václav Havel series. And to me, they demonstrate what is absolutely the best about Jiří's work. And that is, although he comes to things from social theory and legal philosophy, he covers the gamut. He absolutely epitomizes interdisciplinarity. We often talk about that. He lives and breathes it. To read his work is to go through a breathtaking series of references, literally from de Tocqueville to Titian, Kafka to Woolf, Plato and Aristotle. I could go on. I make so many notes and tabs when I read his work, and I'm always left feeling refreshed and fulfilled and asking many questions. His most recent book, In Quest of History on Czech Statehood and Identity, and his previous book, which also has the word question in it, kind of makes me wonder if all of this living in Wales has rubbed off on him, all these quests and questions. Perhaps the potential historicity of Arthur and the Arthurian legend has somehow entered his DNA. Dr. Přibáň deftly navigates the interplay between history and narrative, legitimacy and sovereignty, modernity and nationalism, politics and memory, and of course, perhaps more relevant to the topic today, globalization and populism. What I also really appreciate about his work is while he discusses political, cultural, historical tensions and paradoxes, he never tries to force resolution or search for easy answers. He chooses instead nuance, evidence, inclusion, and pluralism. He's absolutely recognized as one of the foremost Czech public intellectuals of the day. He's equally respected among Czech intelligentsia, as well as globally oriented legal scholars, at home with dense academic publishing, while, as Rob alluded to earlier, intervening meaningfully in current affairs and public events. So without any further delay, I would like to pass the virtual microphone over to Jiří so he can enlighten us with his presentation today. I should say quickly that he's going to speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then I'm going to ask some questions that I'm going to craft while he's speaking. Then I'd like to invite you to use the Q&A function. If you have questions in Zoom, I will try and collate and amalgamate and make as much time for those questions as possible. If you are a student, please make that known to me. Rob will also do his best to make that known to me, because we always like to privilege the questions of students at CERES and at the University of Toronto. So we want to make sure that you have the first opportunity to ask questions. So without any further delay, Jiří, I will pass it over to you.
Okay, good morning to Toronto from a sunny afternoon in Cardiff. And as you can see me, I'm fidgeting with my screen because I try to avoid sunshine and I want to be seen. But first of all, I'm blushing, and it's not because of the heat, because it's never too hot in Cardiff in Wales. And I'm blushing because of what Rob said, what Barbara said, and I feel humbled. And you're absolutely right, Rob. 2 years ago at that conference in Toronto, I felt like, I always keep saying that I have two homes now, Prague and Cardiff, Bohemia and Wales, but it was a strange feeling that coming to University of Toronto and the city of Toronto, I felt very, very homey. And it was indeed because of great colleagues, great scholarship, but also great friends. And I consider, I feel very privileged that I can deliver this talk for your institution, for your center, and it can be in conversation with Barbara. And I also want to express my gratitude and also my greetings to Georgina, Mila, and Ivo, who I met 2 years ago, and I had the most wonderful time with. And I hope that these meetings will continue as soon as COVID disappears. But without further delay and expressing my gratitude to be with you, I would like to share some quick ideas and reflections on what's going on right now. I think Barbara mentioned that I like questions, and I looked at this title, and of course, it has a question mark. And we live in fascinating times, not just here in the United Kingdom, but also in European Union and, United States, presidential election. We know every presidential election is the most important in history, but we shouldn't underestimate the importance of this one. So who's afraid of constitutional populism? And I use this very quick introduction just to show the map of Center Europe. I could show you a cartoon, because if you go to Prague or Budapest or Krakow, people would be very offended if you call them East Europeans, as we know. But the notion of Center Europe usually dates to the Habsburg Empire and to the times of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the dual monarchy. But today, whatever you look at there at the map of Europe, there's clearly this Visegrad 4, V4, the countries in the European Union. There's a big territory of Germany, but also nearby are the Balkan countries and the Baltic countries. So today, Central Europe is a concept from political geography, but also of particular cultures, histories, and I will try to briefly go through this. Okay. Very quickly, this is, what is this map for? It's a map of Europe that shows data for anything. And usually when you look at this map, of course, Western Europe, fine. Central Europe, okay-ish, but the further east you go, the more problematic it gets, and the further south you go, more problematic it gets. This is, of course, a sarcasm, an academic sarcasm on how not to measure and rate things, but it also shows some preconceptions, including prejudices about the Central European territory, sometimes like Ivan Krastev, we already mentioned him, when you discuss the rise of populism in Central Europe, people usually mention Poland, Hungary, and then what about, the question comes, what about Czech Republic? So, Czech Republic is exception to this. Well, yes and no, and sometimes it's played to Czech exceptionalism, and sometimes I even say I had this strange experience of representing two most Eurosceptic countries in the European Union, United Kingdom, and Czech Republic. Not anymore. Britain is out, and I hope that Czech exceptionalism won't lead to Czech Republic one day opting for Czechzit. But let's move on. And because this is about constitutional populism, is there anything wrong about populism? And when you talk to democratic politicians, you know that they then sooner or later, all of them will confess. Every politician in democracy has to some extent be a populist. I don't have to use the example of the Canadian Prime Minister, but populism is a style of politics which has the capacity to persuade people by common language, by what we call doxa, the public opinion, that you can steer the public opinion your way. And in that respect, populism is not a problem per se. It's a style of politics. And because you want to speak on behalf of the people, and you want to talk directly to this constituent power of the people. Well, here is a picture of 1989 and Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution, and you have a picture of Václav Havel, and clearly he was somebody who was anything but a nature-born politician. And the first speeches by Havel were making us all very anxious, because we wanted him to become president, and he didn't speak like one. He certainly spoke the language and discourse of an intellectual. After a couple of years, even an intellectual like Havel mastered political simplifications and presidential speeches which would be attuned to the common ear. When we talk about populism, we know it's related to popular sovereignty. For constitutionalists and historically, this is a problem, and I used it. Modern state became the nation state legitimized by the sovereignty of the people. It's only here in Britain where we have sovereignty of parliament. But your power has returned to you, people. Yeah, it was one of the main slogans of 1989. And the Central European countries after 1989 had a very unique experience of rebuilding popular sovereignty, independent statehood, but at the same time, democratic constitutionalism. And part of this rebuilding sovereignty was joining the European Union, which was just born a couple of years later in early 90s, 1992. So its paradox is that people is the sovereign, but it is also always represented. Legally unbound sovereignty has the exclusive form of a constitution. So lawyers don't like it, but at the same time, the people likes its constitution. So the constitution making was very, very important from the very beginning. Well, when I said populism, populism has some darker sides. And I don't know how young people today, Generation Zero, is familiar with the films from the turn of the century. But what is the problem about populism is beautifully illustrated in one film by the Coen brothers, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? It's set in 1930s, late 30s, post-crisis Mississippi, and the state elections are coming up, and two candidates stand for the governor, and the incumbent, who is Pepe O'Daniel, and challenged by Homer Stokes. If you read this, you can read a typical populist discourse. Cannot afford 4 more years of cronyism, nepotism, racialism, service of the inner interest. The choice is clear. Homo Stokes, servant of the common man. So obviously all populists appeal to the common people. What is risky about populism if populists appeal and use this appeal to attack the center as the establishment or even the deep state, and if they portray themselves as sweeping the state clean, fighting against corruption? All populists fight against corruption. Here you have a broom, and you can imagine this person trying to heal the society. What is problematic about populists is that, like Homer Stokes, it can turn out to be that he was the hidden ground wizard of Ku Klux Klan and a leading racist. You never know what you get with populists. And I don't have to look too far, but obviously you can mention the United States today, but you also can mention the other countries, United Kingdom with populism on the left, on the right, and with populists all around Europe. In Italy, you have Salvini on the right, you have Di Maio on the left, and five-star movement. In France, the centrist populist movement of President Macron was also new and completely sweeping away the old establishment. Well, clearly we live in interesting times when many people are just justifiably disenchanted and disappointed and protesting against the current state of things. And so the constitutional democratic order had its, or has been having its hard times ever since the deep crisis, the financial crisis of 2008. We can see it in particular in Europe, and the question is, however, and what is special is about Central Europe. So populism can bring some nasty politics and even appeal to the darkest drives, collective drives in respective societies. Whether nativism, one example would be Salvini's appeal to the glorious past and glorification of even the authoritarian past. But if you look at the British situation around Brexit, there were two different parties with two different sets of nostalgia. Conservative nostalgia of the 50s when Britain was the empire, and Labour nostalgia of the 70s when they still believe that the welfare state is the solution of all ills. Why am I talking about it? To return to Central Europe. Because in Central Europe, in the last 10 years, we've been seeing something which is happening everywhere and which is labeled by journalists or academics as democratic backsliding. But in some countries, it exactly takes the form of constitutional counter-revolution. Okay, Hungary is mentioned all the time, but no, it is mentioned for very good reasons. Why? Because Viktor Orbán criticized the corrupt government of the left-wing socialists that ruled in the first decade of this century. And yes, indeed, it was a very corrupt government. He was right about it. But what followed was even more dangerous than all corruption, because what followed was He won constitutional majority. He drafted new constitution, and his idea was to completely reload politics of Hungary. First, with the constitution, removing all precedents of the Constitutional Court of Hungary. So basically cleaning the slate of constitutional justice, having new constitutional document, new constitution. And it was enacted in 2011. And 3 years later, Viktor Orbán made an infamous speech in the Spa, Tusnad Fürde by Tusnad, which is in Romania, but the place is populated by ethnic Hungarians, and this is an annual meeting of the youth where he made this statement. Hungarian nation is not a simple sum of individuals, but a community that needs to be organized, strengthened, and developed. We're talking about ethnic nation, and in this sense, the new state that we are building is an illiberal state, a non-liberal state. It would be harder to find another example of a more outspoken, a more direct attack on constitutional freedoms and democracy, basically the settlement that was ruling Europe post-1989 and that brought those countries to the European Union in 2004. 10 years later, you have a new member state of the European Union, which has the prime minister who officially declares the end of liberal democracy and the reload of Hungary as the nation state based on the welfare of the nation and not freedoms. Well, it took from bad to worse because a year later comes the migration crisis. And asylum seekers and migrants are leaving Turkey and coming in millions to Europe. And they are blocked and at the Hungarian border. And ever since, Orbán and other populists in Europe used the migration crisis as the defining moment of their rise and a critique of the European status quo. Of course, if you're building a liberal democracy, you must have an enemy. And the most frightening, the most provocative ticket that you can do it on is you find your public enemy number one. In Hungary, it is George Soros. Yeah? A billionaire philanthropist who is outspoken defender of liberal values, open society, and who coincidentally sponsored Viktor Orbán's fellowships in United States and Western Europe when he was a young student and activist. I specifically have chosen this, this is related to the election, it's a pre-election campaign, and Viktor Orbán's movement put up these billboards as part of the campaign. Don't let Soros laugh at you, because Soros was depicted as somebody who actively promoted migration, who was actively working against the Hungarian state, who was this dark figure of anti-national, acting against national interests. And Viktor Orban, immediately, he was accused of anti-Semitism, but Viktor Orban is a clever politician. So he said, no, 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 this is just a personal campaign, which is typical of Anglo-Saxon political culture. We in Central Europe must get used to it. Well, definitely his voters immediately got the message, because they started writing on forehead of on Soros's forehead, "Dirty Jew." So yes, you can pretend it's nothing to do with anti-Semitism, but you recreate a typical anti-Semitic trope, which was so strong in Hungary, Austria 100 years ago, and you still build on it. All right. So this is the problem with populism in Central Europe, that it's not just anti-liberal. It's not an illiberal state. It's profoundly nationalist and authoritarian state. Today, Hungary is an authoritarian state where the election results are already known. It's so close. Some scholars, such as András Bozoki, argue persuasively that today's Hungary is closer to Kadar's communist times and Horthy's fascist Hungary than to any functioning democracy in the European Union. I'm coming to the final bit, which is so what can we do about constitutional or anti-constitutional populism? Populists who in Central Europe want to change the constitutional regime, because something similar is happening in Poland. And what can be done? For instance, it's interesting how this decolonization theory and anti-imperialist language is used by the conservative right in Central Eastern Europe, accusing Brussels of moral imperialism. This is Orban's word. Yeah, you're moral imperialists imposing your values on us, but we have our values. European Union has limited powers, and European Union cannot do a lot, but it can do something. In last month, it issued its historical first annual rule of law report. So it's just a couple of weeks old. And it was exactly a response to democratic backsliding. And I don't want to create an impression, a false impression that it's only Central Europe which suffers from democratic backsliding. Look at Britain, look at Spain, where what is happening in Spain right now with the Judicial Council. Look at Malta, overtly corrupt government killing its critics. So there is a lot of things to do for European Union, but the response is general. And what is important about the report, it goes, it is a report on every member state in 4 respects: the system of justice, anti-corruption, media pluralism and freedom, which is very interesting and very important, that the rule of law is inseparable from independent minor protection of independent institutions, and clearly institutional issues related to checks and balances. Okay. You can read the report, it's available, it's very interesting. It's been criticized by activists for doing too little too late. It's been even more criticized by Orban, who called on the vice president of the European Commission to resign, who dismissed the report together with Polish Prime Minister and President as biased against Poland and Hungary. But it's just, so you can tell that European Commission is doing something, and it is probably doing something right. Why? Because it can invest. What can the Commission do is it can investigate threats. It can recommend to activate Article 7 and postpone voting rights for a member state. But the problem is this has to be done unanimously. It can open infringement procedure, and all this is just law. You can almost say this is just European constitutionalism. And now comes the most important part of the whole report, something which is not in the report, because it can propose the budget conditionality procedures, which aims to protect the budget and EU funding to relate to the rule of law accountability. So we're coming to a very interesting point, historical point, in which what is quite likely to happen and evolve in future is that the European Union will condition structural EU funds, and billions go to the Center East European countries. It will be conditioned by the rule of law criteria. Well, if I sound too optimistic right now, the skeptical aspect of all of this is whatever's going to happen, the current constitution, European supranational constitutional framework doesn't allow, it still can be blocked by one country. So Poland will always support Hungary and vice versa. And what is, however, quite interesting in this respect, skeptically, German investment in Central Europe over the last 3 decades is bigger than investment in other parts of the European Union. So Germany is a big stakeholder in those countries. So any radical motion against these new member states is quite unlikely because of German business interests, which also explains why conservative German and Austrian members of European Parliament and politicians from CDU, Christian Democratic Union, Christian Social Union in Germany, or People's Party in Austria, were actively supporting Orban in the past 10 years. And even during the migrant crisis, because Orban said some things that they wouldn't dare expressing. And that's why the problem of Central Europe is a European problem. And the problems of European politics have their specific reflections and consequences in Central European countries. Whether we are coming to a breaking point is another matter, but right now we can conclude that the populist tide, which started first after the economic crisis and then after the migrant crisis, has been surprisingly in European Union stopped by the COVID crisis. Why? Because populists can speak to doxa, to the public opinion, but they don't have the expert knowledge. The common language of populists is that they despise experts, they label them as elitists, but if you want to fight something like COVID, you need expertise, you need episteme, and populists don't have it. So this is optimistic, but don't rely on the assumption that populists, because they don't have responses to the COVID crisis, they would disappear. They won't disappear, and if the center cannot hold, we can expect another crisis and another rise of constitutional populism. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, thanks very much, Jiří. I hope everybody can now hear me. I'm just going to lead with a couple of, well, maybe just one really big question, because I already see a question in the Q&A bar from Anna Heron, who always asks a good question, and I want to make sure she gets a chance to ask it. But you know, I guess I'm a little less. You know what? I need to put my video on. Sorry. I guess I've been busy looking at my typewriting screen. I guess I'm a little less optimistic than you are, Jiří. To quote probably our mutual friend Jeff Isaacs, we're kind of living in, you know, democracies in dark times. I get the negative dimensions of populism, and you've outlined those very well. And the democratic politics always has an element of populism, got that too. But we're also at a place, and Hungary demonstrates this, of potentially profound democratic failure. And weirdly, Central Europe is showing leadership in how this can happen. But given gross political manipulation, money in politics, we haven't even talked about foreign interference, corrupt leaders, as you described, constitutional muckraking, the echo chambers of social media, these popular appeals to nativism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, or any other kind of law and order arguments you can generate. Where do we go to find some positive hope? I guess I want to look beyond and maybe more structurally and philosophically beyond you know, the nuclear option of the European Union or conditionality attached to money. So so give me some hope, Jiří.
Yes, yeah, it's, I promised I would be speaking, I would be delivering an optimistic speech, but it's, you're absolutely right about, these risks, and that these risks shouldn't be underestimated, yeah? And there's one big difference between New Europe and Old Europe, which is that our institutions are just 30 years old now. Yeah? The new democratic constitutionalism that has been appearing, has been established in early 90s, those institutions are still fresh and young, and too much depends on individuals who take the posts. Yeah? And for instance, so far, Czech Republic was lucky because it got populists to power, but they are anti-politics. Yeah, we are like in Italy in the 1990s. Only a Czech prime minister isn't as flamboyant and such a womanizer like Silvio Berlusconi. But so far, we escaped this because because no government in the Czech Republic could be formed as one-party government, which is great, yeah? And because the Constitutional Court has been robust and acting independently. But these risks are here because it's still very young. I can imagine that even if Marine Le Pen gets to power in France, it wouldn't mean a constitutional coup. They would somehow survive it like America will have survived Trump, yeah? But it takes one politician, Orban in Hungary, to completely redesign the constitutional regime. And in Poland, this is what is happening right now, these weeks and months. So, I think you correctly, so one difference is fragility of the new system. Second is the power of oligarchy. We know that, power always talks, money always talks to power and talks powerfully, but what you can buy in terms of money and new oligarchs, you can buy the whole state. And we saw it in Hungary. Hungary is basically an oligarchic state, and look at Slovakia. And so what actually happened was that economic transformations that were running established new elites who are very often more cynical and more skeptical about the rule of law and constitutionalism than in other parts of the European Union. But, and here I think I would have a slightly different and more optimistic view, because there is still so much depends economically on being member of the European Union, for Hungary. We're talking about significant percent of GDP that completely depends upon European structural funds. So the risk of Hungary completely leaving the European Union, or Poland leaving, or Czech Republic leaving, is minimal. And therefore, this economic diplomacy can be more efficient.
I would totally agree with you, but I also think that the European Union needs to flex its muscle more to the point that it already has, and I'm sure you wouldn't disagree with me on that point. I want to pass it over to some specific questions from students, I'll deal with the question of populism first, and then we'll get more specifically into two questions about COVID. David Kitai, a student, says that why has populism in Central Europe come largely from the right? Whereas, as you yourself indicated, and you've indicated in your written work, that you see this left-wing populism as epitomized, for example, by Geoffrey Corbyn in the Labour Party in the UK. You've seen it come from the left. You see it a little bit coming from the left in other places as well. Even the United States, although their left, I would say, is like moderately center anywhere in the rest of the world. But why is it that it seems to be much more of a right-wing phenomenon than a left-wing phenomenon?
That's a terrific question. Yeah, it's absolutely great question, right to the point. And I think that one reason is there are some striking differences between Western Europe and Central Europe. One of them is that voters of the left-wing parties are socially conservative. Yeah, they have been, if you want to get an anti-migrant, anti-gay, anti-Roma electorate, you look to the left. Yeah? In not just Communist Party of Czech Republic, not just the Linke so they are culturally conservative, Linke in former East Germany. And so for the nationalist right to go and dig into the electorate, it is a very efficient tool how to steal the electorate of the left by expanding the nationalist, nativist discourse, because this is how you can chip into the left-wing electorate, or you could do it, and you can see it in the Czech Republic today. That part of the left-wing electorate went with the new populist welfarism of Prime Minister Babiš, and the rest has disappeared to the anti-migration, Islamophobic. It's funny, Czech Republic doesn't have any Muslims yet. We have the xenophobic, Islamophobic party, or so-called the Party of Direct Democracy, which oddly enough is the leader of the party is ethnic half Japanese. Yeah, so it's one of those paradoxes. But so one reason is that it was an efficient way how to steal voters from the post-communist left. And the other reason is that, yes, all those countries were rebuilding their independence, their national sovereignty. So you mustn't forget that 1992, Czechoslovakia split because of the rising nationalism and chauvinism. Peacefully, we call it the Velvet Divorce after the Velvet Revolution. Yet, it was the consequence of national and nationalist aspirations. And so it's easier to argue from this right-wing, sovereigntist, nationalist position. And even in Czech Republic, where you do not have the basically the neo-fascist propaganda of Fidesz and Jobbik, where you do not have just yesterday Constitutional Tribunal of Poland, now controlled by peace, is just a rule, banned all abortions. Yeah, so it's almost impossible to, it's so pro-life that abortions are literally banned in Poland. So you don't have this moral conservative right in Czech Republic, but you have this discourse of Brussels dictates to Prague, or we're gonna dissolve like a sugar cube in the sea of European Union. Yeah, so you have this even in the Czech discourse, and I think it's also the consequence of this just 30 years of rebuilding national independence.
I mean, I get your point there. I mean, one of the legacies of resistance, I suppose, and dissent was, you know, to find solace, haven in a heartless world of authoritarian communism in community, family, nation. So, you know, the sovereignty rings very true after 1989. I want to turn a little bit more towards more recent discussions of COVID, and particularly perhaps you can bring out some themes from your recent Eurasian piece in response to these two related questions. The first question from Anna Heron, also a graduate student of CERES. What effects do you think the pandemic will have on the populist governments of Central Europe, particularly Czechia? Could it lead to the fall of Babiš, as some people hope? And another recent, about to graduate student from CERES, Daniela Bouvier-Valente, says, on the topic of COVID hurting populists, such as Babiš and perhaps some of the other leaders in Czechia as well, what about a little more analysis on the recent regional elections? You know, ANO wins the most votes. At the same time, the opposition parties win enough votes amongst each other to form governing coalitions in many of the regions. Does this signal a kind of a positive or just changing tide in some way or another? So how does COVID play into all of these political developments in Czechia?
I'm just amazed by the detailed knowledge in this discussion, and I wouldn't imagine that people have such profound knowledge of regional discussion, regional elections. And you're absolutely right. What happened yesterday? New Minister of Healthcare appointed, because you know Czechs. We suffer from two complexes. One is that out there the world is dangerous. Yeah? So the best thing always happen at home. And second is we know everything best. So the first wave of COVID in the spring, Czech government closed borders early, so there was hardly any COVID cases and hardly just over 300 people died. So they did marvelously, and of course, Czech Prime Minister, who is populist but anti-ideology, he's basically, his creed is, I'm running the state as if it were a company, and it means efficiency, technique, technocracy rather than plutocracy, but well, we know who Babiš is. Then, with the second wave, a complete disaster happened. Nobody planned for the second wave. Everybody was relaxed, and people stopped listening. And now, in summer, we came to Prague, and it all looked like ministers were wearing T-shirts, best in the world in COVID, yeah? And obviously, now we are the worst in the world, yeah, in COVID. And so what happened yesterday, this new Czech Minister of Healthcare, who happens to be a military doctor epidemiologist, yeah? So he is a soldier, he is an epidemiologist, he is an entrepreneur, and he was spotted by paparazzi outside a restaurant, and you know all restaurants are now closed in Czechia, in the whole of Czechia, and they can sell food over the counter, but only until 8 o'clock in the evening in face masks. What appeared in the media was a picture of minister around midnight walking out from a restaurant without a face mask. And it's interesting that Babiš knows that this is a complete fiasco. This is a disaster. So he is the one who is calling for the minister's resignation right now. So Babiš tries to save his bacon by turning against his most favorite people in COVID, which only shows the level of public relations disaster that is COVID. And you can see it in the polls right now. Since the election, his movement lost on average 5% of the vote. So there is a significant, beyond statistical, his movement is losing popularity. Now, to interpret the regional elections and the Senate elections, I think, Barbara, I also will use an optimistic side and then more realistic side, yeah? So first, as regards the results, it's clear that ANO movement is by far the most popular movement and party in the Czech politics. It indicates so the last decade and the rise of the ANO movement hasn't been turned around yet. However, the good thing about Czech politics, unlike in Poland, unlike in Hungary, even at the peak of popularity, ANO managed to get around 30% of vote, which is almost like the golden rule of post-89 Czech politics. Even the most popular party cannot mobilize more than over 1/3 of the vote, which means that in the end, it will always end up in some coalition. It can be centrist coalition or a dirty coalition with extremists, and Babiš manages both right now. Yeah, he rules with social democrats, but at the same time he's supported by communists and right-wing extremists. And in that sense, regional elections didn't change a lot. It proved that ANO is very popular, that it's now rooted in regional politics. But at the same time, on the positive side, is the Pirate Party is also rooted in regional politics. It managed to get many more seats in regional assemblies. And the Pirate Party is not just a seasonal thing right now. Yeah, so it means that you have another populist party. Of course, it's a parody that Czechs who don't have the sea is the only country, I think, apart from Iceland, that has the Pirate Party in the parliament. And it is also now entrenched as the main alternative to ANO movement. Third comment I want to make on this, which is more ambivalent. So yes, a positive and negative. The good thing about the Senate election is that it proved that the Senate as the constitutional upper chamber is absolutely vital, and it works as a most important check and balance on the power of the executive and the lower chamber of parliament. And it's completely dominated by the opposition. However, it also shows, the election also revealed limits of coalition potential on the conservative side of the spectrum. So because ODS, former dominant party, was putting candidates, its candidates against other liberal centrist candidates. So ODS wants to dominate and is not the partner who would want to share too much power or give in too much power. But at the same time, the Pirate Party is forging now alliance or coalition with the mayor's party, Starostové. So there is something emerging in the center of the political spectrum. So my positive reading would, my negative reading would be, you cannot say that ANO has received the fatal blow by its blunders in the second wave of COVID in the second half of the summer. But at the same time, what is happening in Czech political system, in the party system, is you have these reconfigurations which can play potentially a bigger role against the ever weaker ANO movement.
Okay, one final student question from Kia Jacobson. Kia, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Do you think what do you think the full impact of the pandemic will be on Hungarian politics, especially since you've held out Orban to be the kind of, illiberal politician par excellence? Do you think the pandemic will effectively allow Orban to push his illiberalism to the limits? And will that ultimately be effective?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a Hungarian academic, because my Hungarian friends are so pessimistic, and yeah, it's the problem with Hungary, and I really liked the depiction of Hungarian current democracy by the European Commissioner Věra Jourová as ill democracy. Viktor Orban called it illiberal democracy. She played with the word illiberal, and she removed this second half of the word, and she just put it's an ill democracy. My reading would be it's much worse, because it's in a state of clinical death. Why? Because what happened in Hungary since the beginning of COVID was that Orban also played it very well. There was no COVID risk in Hungary, and Hungary closed its borders immediately. So this symbolic xenophobic effect, out there is a danger, but I will protect you, actually played to the Orban's tune. And second, during pandemic, the last independent islands in Hungarian civil society and opposition were removed. So opposition had some power at local level. The state of exception during pandemic allowed Orban to remove funding, and of course he removed local funding exactly from those places where opposition was in power. Second, he tightened the freedom of expression, and so any criticism of government can be now used as dissemination of fake news, and it's criminalized. Third, if you noticed, Hungary was the country which, the only country which declared a state of emergency for indefinite period of time. And it was impossible even in ancient Roman times. Dictator had a limited period in office and only for a specific job to be done. And Orban even ruled that, and this is extremely important, the state of exception allowed for army to take over control of strategic companies in the country during this state of exception, which, as we witnessed, resulted in removal of unloyal managers and their replacement by managers and entrepreneurs loyal to Viktor Orban and his Fidesz. So what happened in Hungary in springtime was actually solidification of this clientelist state, which cannot be called democracy. And with the change of electoral law, it's virtually impossible for opposition to make any comeback at national level. So it really looks like Horthy's Hungary, which also had some opposition parties, which also had some critics, but which could never represent a serious challenge to the established order and government. So I'm afraid my reading here is much more skeptical, and I believe that Viktor Orban actually solidified its state, its power, his power, his position, and even he successfully plays the extremist card. He says it's either me or Jobbik, and Jobbik are true fascists. But so do you want to have fascism with human face?
Well, I think you've come around to agreeing to Andras Bojicki's point of view, and he's a person that's usually far more pessimistic than you usually are. So I'm not sure I feel good about that. Kia, in short answer, the answer to your question is sadly, yes. There's one final, I know I said that was the last question, but there's one final question that I want to post here because I think it's very relevant. It comes to us from Yona Zamfir, who's an undergrad at McGill University in Montreal. You mentioned that these constitutional populist leaders use external threats, as we saw with the migration crisis, now with COVID, to consolidate their power. Could you take this analysis a step further and add anything concerning internal threats, particularly minorities such as LGBTQ communities, the Roma, for example? How do these the exclusion of these folks, otherwise construed as citizens, one would think, of the relevant communities and countries, how does this exclusion cater to nationalist or nativist populism?
Of course, it's thank you. It's very relevant, and it's interesting because here you have some striking differences in different parts of Central Europe, and it's for instance, in terms of nationalism, I mentioned that Czech right-wing populism could never formulate, could never build on imaginaries of grand history of Hungarian kingdom or Polish big state which disappeared and then reappeared, and this strong national culture. It would never appeal. Yeah, the Czechs would immediately laugh at it. Yeah, if you say, "Well, we are inheritors of Saint Václav," yeah, and I can imagine immediately, "And who told you so?" Yeah, it would be almost like Monty Python's King Arthur. So this historical discourse would never play in Czechia, but Czech right-wing extremism, it was for many years was defined by two main things. One is anti-Roma racism, and the second one was, of course, anti-Sudeten Germans. So every time you wanted to play to this tune, either you mentioned Germans, and it's almost like Fawlty Towers, and don't mention the war. So you mention the war, you mention the Germans, and you attract. And second, really anti-Roma, most nasty racist prejudice. And so in this respect, yes, it's true. When it comes to LGBT, of course, the European news, I don't know about Canada, it's full now of, for instance, LGBT-free zones in some Polish municipalities. Yeah, it's not a national policy. That's interesting. Polish government is careful enough, yes, to speak in favor of family values, and but they wouldn't go that far, but they would tolerate it to do it by local politicians and councillors. And it's what is fascinating is, and now I want to really, I don't want to sound like a naive liberal academic now. Yeah. We live in difficult times of high migration, globalization, and even in Western parts, living in United Kingdom, migration is a problem. What is fascinating in Central Eastern Europe is it's not so much immigration, because no Syrians or Iraqis would want to end up living in Bratislava. Of course, they want to go to Berlin. Yeah, but what is a real problem, with the exception of Czech Republic here, is emigration. The population of Hungary, Poland significantly decreases because especially young generations move to the West. Czechs are much more conservative in this respect, and I think it's also partly because it's so much connected to the German and Austrian economy. So emigration from Czech Republic is a country of immigration, but it's immigrants that we love. Ukrainians, yeah, we even love Vietnamese now, yeah, and but we still will be scared of immigrants who would never come, yeah. So this is really just an empty signifier here, if I may use this. But when it comes to internal minorities, it very often it depends upon cultural identity politics. So it varies from country to country. And here, for instance, talking of Czechia, Czechia has the registered partnerships. It has for gay and lesbian couples. You cannot call it, of course, marriage, but with the exception of adoption, the Act of Parliament provides for equal rights. Adoption rights had been actually adjudicated by the Constitutional Court and the Supreme Administrative Court. So today, if you want to find a way, you will find a way. Even, but it would be, for instance, Babiš's movement was pretty indifferent, and it actually wanted to enact the Gay Marriage Act. Yeah, it was morally, culturally liberal at the beginning, but now, because it you have to remember, Babiš's movement started as an alternative for urban liberal voters who were disgusted by the levels of corruption during Civic Democratic Party, ODS, and Social Democratic Party, CERES, as their years. And but very soon he discovered that this has a limited potential, and his potential is on the left. So more appeal to socially conservative, culturally conservative electorate. And today he wouldn't go in the direction to legislate for the Gay Marriage Act, for instance. Not that gays and lesbians would be openly discriminated or there would be a hate speech promoted, but it's almost like frozen in terms of whether you can provide for the final emancipation of gay and lesbian couples in Czech Republic. Of course, in Poland and Hungary or Slovakia, it's a very different story indeed.
Okay, it's my happy opportunity to thank you just personally, and to say how much I enjoyed your talk and the opportunity to delve into your two most recent books in preparation for this. So thanks on behalf of CERES and all the students who asked great questions. And for a final thank you, I'll also pass it over to Robert Austin, who I think has some other information he'd like to provide. But thank you again very much.
Super, Barbara, thanks very much. You're terrific, huh? Like, absolutely. Just, as I said, we'll be together again soon when we get to the other side. And Barbara is an absolutely fantastic moderator. So we'll probably have her back every 2 weeks as long as she is willing. But she's headed west, right, Barbara?
That's
True?
correct. I'm decamping to the West Coast for hopefully the remainder of COVID.
So that's a 3-hour time difference from here, plus a 5-hour time difference from yours. I still think we can manage it, right?
Last spring, I was teaching starting at 6:30 or 7 in the morning. So I continue to teach and work in Ontario time.
Fantastic. I'll say a bit more about that in a second, but usually I just want to, I know a little bit more about Hungary and Slovakia than Czechia, but thanks for bringing me up to date. I like what you said about Hungary and this Horthy thing, because that's very important to me. And I write quite a bit about that. And, Horthy, is totally resurrected, right? Like if anyone's not sure about that, you need to get to Budapest when this pandemic is over, and Horthy is, still portrayed as savior of the nation, right? From the perils of Bolshevism and fascism, and Orban, who doesn't gravitate towards like a cult of personality, has kind of assumed that mantle in his own way, because he saved the Hungarians from migrants, okay? He saved the Hungarians from George Soros and the CU, right? Because you can put them in a package, the Central European University, and at least at the beginning, much like the Czechs, he saved them from COVID. But that's proven to be hollow. But the Hungarians deal with COVID the way the Americans do, is they just pretend it's not happening. So whether that can, back to the question about the pandemic, whether the Hungarians can continue to believe that, but Hungary is faring very poorly under the current circumstances, and there's not much they can do about it. Having said that, I think, if we have a couple of minutes before I say, I just wanted, usually, I hope you don't mind, and Barbara, I know you'll appreciate this. I just wanted to read just everybody to get a sense of what Barbara said at the beginning, this notion of Jiří is making these meaningful contributions. And I just want to read you this one paragraph, Jiří, and for everybody, that you wrote in the IWM post, which also appeared in Eurasian, which I keep rereading to people, and I've actually almost memorized it, okay? So I just want to read it for everybody. And again, this is about the pandemic. We should also listen to the voices on the other side. For example, that of the Spanish doctor who, exhausted from placing herself at risk every day in the fight against the epidemic, berated the nation, saying that doctors and nurses are paid thousands while football stars rake in millions. It is Messi that people should be going to for a vaccine. And I think I should write a book, say, going to Messi for a vaccine. Similarly, we can query the value of an economic system that, in the past 3 decades, has deepened social inequalities, reduced people's opportunities in life, and indebted first households, and then, to prevent itself from collapsing, entire states by resolving its own crisis on their dime. Okay, this is 2008 all over again, where as you said, the patient dictates the cure. This is an extraordinary circumstance to find yourself in. Continuing, what sort of economic system is that values so poorly the work of nurses, teachers, carers, and others without whom society would have collapsed long ago in today's state of emergency? That is it for me. I urge everyone to go online, read the IWM post, or go to Eurozine and read the other piece by Krastev about why pandemics generate less books, even though they kill more people than the First World War. Like the flu pandemic is an extraordinary death toll of the Spanish flu, as it's so called. This is incredible. But this is me on a rant, and I can even rant when I'm by myself in my office. This is incredible.
I just have to interrupt here because I remind my students all the time, who are military and security professionals, that the biggest killer since the Second World War has not been another war. In fact, the biggest killer you can add of all the wars together is still less than the AIDS pandemic, which has killed more than 20 million people.
Absolutely.
So 20 million people.
Yeah, and as Krastev says on the article, on the First World War, there's 60,000 books written, and on the Spanish flu, there's 400. Right? But again, it's about what, the value of death by war is the value by death by an invisible enemy, such as a pandemic. But on that note, I'm going to shift a bit and try to be positive and say that usually we hope we're going to be back together again. Okay, we're going to meet on the other side. I can't thank you enough. I want to thank Anna Petrov, who from Department of Slavic Language and Literature, as we cooperate on this. in the second in 2021. Her series starts. This first term is kind of my series. She's been a great friend and a great collaborator. But usually, I don't know if you noticed, like when we started, like the events really run smoothly here. I don't know if they do the same at Cardiff. Maybe they do, but we got a great team here. Daria, you met at the beginning, Daria Dumbadze, and Joseph Hawker, you met. Like I always like to conclude by saying that we transitioned into this zone has been made easier and actually even pleasant by the fact that we are fortunate at the Munk School to have such a nice team of people and who are not just co-workers but also friends, and I'm grateful for that. On that note, I wish everybody a terrific weekend. It's a gorgeous day, usually 27 degrees, sun is shining. It's time to pop into the beer store. And since we can kind of legally drink outside in Canada now, this is just one of the many silver linings of a pandemic.
Okay. Let me thank you all, because I really felt so privileged to have a chance and meet you. I feel privileged to be invited and talk to Europe, to you, Barbara, and I want to thank Georgina, Milan, Ivan, and Ivo, and yeah, it's been very stimulating, and I can see how flourishing your place is. What a great community, what great scholarship, and what great friendship you have over there, and I feel so grateful to be part of it. And I hope that we will see each other soon, and those questions from the students, well, what an amazing cohort of students you have. Thank you very much. Thank you. I applaud you.
Usually we stay in touch like always. Best of luck to everybody. Terrific weekend. We see each other in 2 weeks for the next event. Barbara, we talk next week. Ciao, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.